The American dream, the nuclear family, 2.5 kids, 2 cars, but it wasn't always the dream. Let's start in 1913.
Ford hit the Make Cars button, churning out 1,000 cars per day. But with thousands of people in the driver's seats, there were also thousands of people under the wheels. So many, in fact, that in the 4 years after World War I, almost as many Americans died in car crashes as those who died in combat during the war. People were getting so fed up with the many deaths that in 1923, 1/10 of Cincinnati signed a petition to lower speed limits. Of course, with this much support, lawmakers had to listen to the will of the people by launching a racist newspaper campaign blaming China. Deaths caused by cars continued to rise until the point that the president, Calvin Coolidge, had to address it. He asked Herbert Hoover to do something about it. So in 1924, Hoover then hosted the first National Convention on Street and Highway Safety, which was attended by practically nobody but car companies. This paved the way for new laws preventing pedestrian deaths by outlawing walking in the street. Then, when people didn't follow these laws, the auto industry launched another campaign to blame pedestrians for getting hit by cars.
And believe it or not, they leap in front of moving cars. Most of them suffer from an anxiety overdrive, a mania for achievement.
Fast forwarding to the 1950s, President Eisenhower wanted to improve upon this interstate highway system to allow troops to be quickly transported across the country. When elected, he made President of General Motors, Charles Wilson, the Secretary of Defense. When Charles Wilson was asked by Congress if he could make a decision contrary to the interests of GM, he said, "I cannot conceive of one because for years I thought that what was good for our country was good for General Motors, and vice versa." However, Charles proved everybody wrong by suggesting a $2 billion increase in defense spending for building freeways. These freeways were built in the 60s and 70s, often directly through cities. And guess who was disproportionately affected by this? If you guessed people of color, you'd be right. The government bought up poor neighborhoods and then demolished them to build freeways. The surrounding neighborhoods that weren't destroyed faced serious health problems like higher rates of asthma and childhood leukemia.
Moving into the modern day, have things gotten any better? No, not really. Our first issue is suburban sprawl. Suburban sprawl is when there are separate areas for living and daily activities. Your home is in one area, but your work, school, restaurants, and stores are in another. Now we need to talk about zoning for just a second. Here's Seattle's R1 zoning map. All areas highlighted in yellow are zoned exclusively for single-family homes. This creates a vicious cycle of places being far away, needing a car to get to those places, more cars being on the road, and more sprawling infrastructure being built. The extra space between houses isn't much, but it adds up quickly. Every extra mile of power lines, roads, and sewer pipes is paid with our tax dollars. You might think that good public transportation is expensive, but there are so many hidden costs to driving, which leads us to our next issue, parking lot hell. It's no secret that America has a ton of parking. So much parking, in fact, that the University of Arizona estimates that there are 4 parking spaces for every 1 car. Back in the 1950s, cars had become a staple in every household, but traffic engineering was still new. Building parking lots was too expensive for local governments, so a series of laws called minimum parking requirements were put in place. These laws put the responsibility of building parking on businesses rather than governments. These laws aimed for there to always be enough parking for the maximum number of people in a building. Numbers such as 1 parking space per 10 nuns at a nunnery, or 1 parking space per tumbling apparatus at a tumbling gym were used. In the modern day, these spaces cost between $5,000 and $10,000 per space just for flat paved ground. Those expenses aren't just free, they get rolled into the cost of whatever items you are purchasing at that store. Space inefficiency is a big theme for all these issues, so obviously our next issue will also be about things being too big. Trucks, SUVs, and cars in general have been growing for decades, but recently we've seen what I like to call the car's arms race. In a car crash, the bigger, heavier car is safer to be in. As such, people tend to buy bigger and bigger cars. Most cars are designed so that if they hit a pedestrian, they hit the person in the legs, whereas pickup trucks, with their flat fronts, are more likely to hit someone in the torso. So, what does it all mean? I'm not saying that all cars are evil and that everyone should sell their car and buy a bike or ride the bus. Just that you be aware of the world around you. Once you start to notice how much waste there is, it's really hard to unsee it.
Welcome smoking ops in the Honda Civic. I'm smoking ops in the Honda Civic. I'm smoking ops in the Honda